What we'll do is we're going to have three panelists for the next session on research evidence on contemporary issues, and we have a number of strong speakers. We're going to start off with Dr. Alex Piquero. For those of you that are not in the field of academics, for the past 20 years, I believe it is, Alex has been ranked as the #1 criminologist in the field of criminology. He's an extremely productive faculty member. He has more titles than I will be able to list off. I think I stopped counting at 6 or 7 on the bio in terms of affiliations that he has. But he has a very strong expertise in criminological theory with focus on criminal careers, life course theory, as well as crime prevention. And I feel very lucky that he has taken the time to join us today. He's going to be talking a little bit about risk factors and issues related to delinquency over the life course. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to
Thanks, Alex. Good morning. Spent 2 hours yesterday at DFW watching them change a tire on an airplane, which is really interesting. So thanks for being here. Buenos dias for my Hispanic Latino friends. I'm Cuban, so it's nice to see some people in the room. Never give an academic number of slides and number of minutes. We violate those very quickly. So I'm going to talk about, in a very brief term, a very short period of time, what we know about the major risk factors for delinquency and violence of the life course in an international and cross-national context. The ambassador stole my thunder a little while ago, but I had a little homicide rate picture from 2016 to show different cities around the world and then different countries. And over on the left-hand side, those are different cities, and at the top is Los Cabos, Mexico, which had an aberration of a year, followed by Caracas, Acapulco, Natal, Brazil, St. Louis, Missouri, because we have some St. Louis, Missouri aficionados in the room, and then Dallas, my hometown, and then Phoenix, and that's the city of Phoenix flag, and that's the ASU flag, for those of you who are familiar with that. I thought I'd put that down there to show you the relative differences between different countries around the world compared to 3 major U.S. cities. And then here across different countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Venezuela, U.S. Virgin Islands, and then the United States all the way at the bottom. So, of course, anytime you show a graph, the next question is, why do the graphs look the way the graphs do? Right? So the graphs look for us to search for big differences. The ambassador earlier this morning said, here are the usual ones: poverty, drugs, gangs. One that he didn't mention, which is very prominent in Central and Latin America, not as opposed to the United States, is health and nutrition, which is very, very different in Hispanic countries. There's also individual and family differences, such as familial differences, marriage, divorces, schooling, and then individual level differences with respect to things like self-control and so on and so forth. Much of the research on risk factors for delinquency and crime that we know about, at least in the United States, there's been a lot of it, but there are 2 huge limitations. The first one is there has been very little research on race and ethnic differences. That's predominantly because in the United States, we do not do a lot of individual level research on Hispanics. And at the US level, it wasn't until about 3.5 years ago that the FBI started actually collecting and producing arrest figures for Hispanics. I just finished serving a 3-year term on a National Academy of Science panel on modernizing crime statistics, and our report just came out. And one of the things that we actually advocated was the importance of collecting basic information at the national level and the state level on Hispanic offending patterns, which unfortunately in this day and age in the United States we still don't know very much about. Lastly, most of the research that we've done on race differences and ethnic differences have been on samples of non-offenders and general population offenders, not a lot on actual offenders. So what do we know about the generalizability of risk factors? Most of the research in criminology has focused on what we call HICS, or HICS are high-income countries. The United States, Great Britain, Australia, and Canada is where the majority of our research on risk factors comes from, because that's where the majority of longitudinal studies have taken place, because those longitudinal studies cost a lot of money. Much of the research has focused on males to the detriment of what we know about females. In fact, there are only 2 longitudinal studies on female offenders. Ours, that I'm going to talk about in a little while, is one of them. But we know very little about female offending over the life course, and almost no information on race and ethnicity differences in criminal behavior over the life course. And I'm going to talk about a couple of important studies that talk about that. What are the major risk findings in high-income countries? And the reason why I'm talking about high-income countries now is you're going to see some research on low and middle-income countries soon to follow. In high-income countries, the data are very clear. And if I didn't even put up the slide, you'd probably predict them if we're playing the Family Feud for a little bit of time. Impulsivity, low achievement, conduct problems are the top 3 answers on the board. At the family level, it's poor supervision, authoritative parenting, and parental criminal history and drug history. And at the community level, it's a typical low SES and poverty. The evidence on risk factors at these levels is fairly clear across the majority of longitudinal studies. Across race and ethnicity, most of the comparisons that have been done, and there are few and far between, have focused on white and black differences. The majority of those studies show that the same kinds of risk factors predict white offending patterns and black offending patterns, but the risk factor mean levels are simply higher for blacks than they are for whites. So it's not that the risk factors are different, it's just that one value is a little bit more higher or exacerbated in one group than the other. In the few studies that compare Hispanics to whites and blacks, there are, again, more similarities and differences, but there are some unique things that Hispanics have as a function of being Hispanic that whites typically don't have. And those are issues dealing with assimilation and acculturation, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. With respect to immigrants versus native-borns, there is at the political level, a lot of discussion, wrong, about what we know about immigration and crime. The evidence could not be clearer. At the macro level and at the micro level, immigrants do not commit more crime than native-born Americans do. That's a fact, period. All right? Most of the research has been done on macro level differences with respect to immigrants and native-born Americans. Very few studies have done this at the individual level. I was an investigator on a very large study called the Pathways to Desistance Study, which followed 1,354 serious offenders in Philadelphia and Phoenix for 7 years. So thank you to the MacArthur Foundation for giving us a lot of money to do this. We actually compare the longitudinal offending patterns of kids who were born in the United States, kids who were first generation, and kids who were second generation. And what we found was the offending patterns for native-born Americans were always higher than first generation and second generation. That was true for offending in self-report records, that was true for offending in official records, and that was true with property crime, and that was true with violent crime, all the way across. Ours was the only study that has looked at this stuff over time. There's no other longitudinal study that has the ability to look at this information over time, unfortunately. We also did find something very interesting for second-generation youth who come to the United States, in our study from Mexico or Puerto Rico. Those kids who were born, who came to the United States and who had high levels of ethnic identity and also live in the most disadvantaged environments in Phoenix and in Philadelphia, had the highest levels of offending for the second generation. Being a second generation kid myself, I understand what it's like to be stuck in between both worlds, and that's really what the Hispanics who come to the United States have to deal with. They have to deal with the culture of where they came from, and they have to deal with trying to fit in this part of the country. So there's kind of stuck and going back and forth, and that's one of the reasons why we argue for their offending patterns in differences. With respect to sex, as I said earlier, there are very few longitudinal studies that have compared risk factors for males and females. Those studies that have found more similarities than differences. The one distinct difference that cuts across males and females is females are typically subject to more types of sexual abuse and family problems than male offenders are. And that shows up with respect to their higher incidence with respect to offending and for victimization. Country-to-country comparisons are even more rare when you do longitudinal studies, because as I said earlier, most longitudinal studies are done in the United States, very few are done overseas. A couple studies to highlight one that compared Seattle with Osaka. And one of the interesting things about this combined study is that it used the exact same battery. So it collected the exact same independent variables and dependent variables for similar age kids in Osaka, in Japan, and in Seattle. And once again, they showed very similar strong offending patterns with respect to the correlates of crime, high risk-taking, low parental monitoring, and troubled peers. Another set of studies compared Brazil and Britain. Again, very similar findings with respect to the risk factors there. Hyperactivity and conduct disorder, and I'm involved in a longitudinal study in Puerto Rico and in San Juan in the Bronx. We're comparing Puerto Rican kids who are tracked in San Juan and Puerto Rican kids who live in the Bronx, called the Baruca Youth Study, and we find very similar offending patterns with respect to the kids who are raised in San Juan and the kids who are raised in the Bronx with respect to offending. What about LMICs, low and middle income countries? About 75 to 80% of the world's population actually live in these kinds of countries. And a lot of my colleagues here have done very important work in ASU colleagues here, work in Honduras and El Salvador. These are the kinds of countries we're talking about. And when we look at the GDPs of LMIs, they're much, much smaller than the majority of the high-income countries. We're talking about magnitude of order differences. There's very little work done on this. In fact, just about a month ago, there was a great meta-analysis published in Crime and Justice by my friend and colleague Joe Murray that actually looked at what we know about risk factors in low and middle income countries. What we do know is based on a very thin level of research, but what we do know is, again, high-income countries and LMICs share very similar risk factors. Self-control, hyperactivity, bad parenting, delinquent peers. Those things are translational everywhere in the world. Kids with low self-control in one country, kids with low self-control in another country, they're going to be at a higher likelihood of offending. But what low and middle income countries have that are different from the United States are structural problems that magnify the individual level and family level risk factors. Those structural factors include things like civil conflict, migration, acculturation, different types of parenting. If you were to look at Chinese parenting and Hispanic parenting and look at it to American parenting, the styles are actually very, very different. That influences, that culture influences how kids then respond to the things around them. There's also, of course, SES, educational attainment, lack of jobs, and finally, health and nutrition. If you look at quality of nutritional food in a lot of MICs, as well as safe water, it's a magnitude of order difference from what we get used to, literally used to, in the United States. Those of you who've traveled into these countries, you know full well the kinds of things I'm talking about. Research and I am sticking to this. I'm only four seconds over. With respect to research and policy needs, anytime you ask an academic what you need more research. And so I'll tell you, not just that you need more research, but I'll tell you specifically the kinds of research you need. You need cross-national and cross-cultural longitudinal studies, because we don't have those. We don't need yet another longitudinal study of 500 white guys in Boston or 500 white guys in some other city. We got plenty of those. What we don't have are those. We need to have the same kinds of batteries measured in multiple jurisdictions to make sure we can assess the same kinds of risk factors. We also got to pay attention to how certain kinds of risk factors in other countries influence how families then are influenced by those risk factors and how they transmit those risk factors to their children. With respect to policy, Thomas talked a little bit about this earlier. I think he may have referenced some of our meta-analyses on early family parent training programs that we've done. We've done 2 meta-analyses around this around the world. Most of those studies are very effective, but the majority of them are done in the United States at the high level of quasi and experimental research criteria. There's a lot of other studies that don't meet those criteria that are carried out in other countries. The problem is, how do you want to evaluate the science? Do you want to use the highest science? Then you're going to have a smaller pool of studies to draw from. If you lower that bar of quasi-experimental versus really weaker designs, you're going to increase the pool, but you have weaker designs. So you have a balance here of how you trade strong designs, smaller number of studies, weaker designs, bigger studies, but problems in the designs. With the focus prevention, early intervention, early in life, and as my dad's favorite motor oil as a kid growing up was a company called Quaker State, and they had this great logo. You can pay me now, or you can pay me later. And the evidence is very clear that paying people now, or not people, but paying the early intervention now will save you a hell of a lot more dollars later on down the road. 3 minutes past curfew. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much.
We have a question Q&A.
On the early family child training programs, you referenced our meta review. One of the challenges that we had is that when we looked at those, they were effective, but they didn't. They very rarely reported outcomes like literally criminal offending.
Yeah.
They were on aggression,
delinquency,
or these things.
Yeah.
And it creates a complication in advising because you have to make this indirect
leap.
And I just wonder what your thoughts are about how to message that evidence and how to interpret it.
So I think the link between aggression and other offending down the road is pretty strong. So I'm willing to make that leap because the evidence on the risk factor literature shows that early life aggression in the first 5 years of life is a real strong predictor of delinquency in adolescence and violence in adulthood. So I'd be willing to make that leap. I feel, because I know the evidence is pretty strong on that internationally. I would be.
So, during our 6-year project in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the things that we ended up doing was spending a lot of time with detectives out on the street. And so we ended up attending quite a few homicide scenes. And Trinidad was one of the countries on your high homicide list there. One of the things, this isn't what we were there to study, but one of the things that I observed when we were there is I observed children often playing around corpses. And I just couldn't help but notice that there was a lack of alarm that among people would be drinking beer, playing music, and kids are playing, and there's a dead guy over there and a crime scene processing unit trying to process the crime scene. It led me to wonder about, in these very violent environments, about the role of just trauma, these kinds of heightened levels of trauma, and how they might influence things.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
So that's a good point. The trauma then becomes desensitization to what that is. We, in the few studies that we've looked at, we actually, in San Juan in the Bronx, we actually have a measure of exposure to violence, both direct and indirect. In the Bronx, the exposure to violence was much higher for those kids than it was in San Juan. This is when we were collecting it in the San Juan of before the hurricane, a little bit different. And in the Bronx areas, which at the time the data were collected is not the certain kind of the high-rise Bronx of today, the higher exposure to violence was related to more offending and more victimization in the Bronx, but not there. And I think the argument is, it's traumatic, but at some point, you reach this point, it's like, okay, well, that's just part of life.
Is there prevention programming to address that specific issue?
Except for dealing with the problem, the violence around them. That's the genesis of the problem. So I think that's something that's not that's something the police can deal with, very quickly, obviously. Yeah.
The question that I was waiting to ask you was, knowing what we know about literature in high-income countries with respect to risk and protective factors associated with delinquency, violence, drug use, and a number of other problem behaviors, if Latin America and the Caribbean are a unique, sort of stage where they can take what other folks have learned, apply it, and say, okay, what are the most important things that need to be done now? Because in high-income countries, we've gone through a lot of issues along the way, right? What worked in terms of research designs, what did not work, where should our priorities be, what's replicatable, what's not replicatable. If you had to name 3 things that should be the priority for low-income countries, what would those be?
Nurse home visits during pregnancy in the first few years of life. Evidence of that is very clear, starting with the OLDS program. It's been replicated in lots of parts around the world. So that's in prevention. Early family and parent training programs in the first decade of life. The evidence on that is clear. So those 2 things for prevention, and then intervention, CBT. Even though it's name or medicine or whatever it is that you raised earlier, that stuff is really strong, really powerful. It works. It costs money, but it works very strong. So that's, I would do the first things early in life, and then the CBT when those things fail.
And then what about for research? What should the agenda for research look like in the near future?
Whether or not these things are translatable across race, ethnicity, and males and females.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Thank you.
I'll translate. Buenos días. Me salta una pregunta.
I have a question.
El estudio es tan largo
This study is so long
que
that
en los gobiernos de Latinoamérica
in the,
y la extensión de los tiempos de ellos normalmente andan entre 4 y 5 años.
it takes around 4 to 5
Implementar
years
estrategias
to
a partir
implement these types
de la
of
producción de
studies.
resultados tan
The
extraordinarios
results of these,
no asegura la inversión
that it doesn't-
local ni
that doesn't
la
give the
sostenibilidad
funds
de una implementación de un programa.
to give the implementation of that program.
Y específicamente con
Specifically
niños.
with kids.
Y esa es la pregunta.
And that's my question.
Gracias. Yo sé que tú dices. I'll answer it in English. I can speak to it in Spanish, or Cuban Spanish, which is very different from regular Spanish. So I sat on an NAS panel once with Chuck Ramsey, who at the time was the chief of police of Washington, D.C. And this is when we were evaluating the National Institute of Justice research portfolio. And he sat next to me, he goes, we were listening about experiments, he goes, oh, I love these experiments, they're awesome. But I don't have 7 years to wait for the results, because I need to make a decision right now. So that has always stayed in my head. And the idea here is, I know some of these things can work and they're translatable right now. I don't need to wait 5 years for the science to show up. I can wait 5 years for the evaluation of that science to show up, but the programs like the Incredible Years and Triple P, those things work right now. So in my mind, I don't think we need to wait 5 years for those scientific studies to come out, because we have over 20 real strong pieces of evidence to show that. So I don't think we need to wait 5 years for the actual science. We need to do that, but for the programs that have a really strong evidence base, we can do them and do them right now. Assuming we want to prioritize the money to do that.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.